Hello everybody, and here we are again for another little chat about Dawlish history. And we've moved position, we're a little bit quieter here today. We've moved up onto Lea Mount to continue talking about John Eady Manning, and we'll get on to Brunel as well, and how Dawlish really expanded during the 1800s. Now we're standing up, as I say, in Lea Mount Park, which is up above Dawlish, and this was owned many years ago by a gentleman who owned what is now Lanherne. Now, before Lanherne was there, the block of flats, there was an 1860s private house built there, which was originally called Blythe, and changed its name to Lanherne sometime in the early 1900s. And Blythe was rather a fine early Victorian mansion, but not the first house on the site. There was actually a Gothic mansion there from about the 1780s, which was called Seagrove. And that was a very handsome building. Unfortunately, there's no real photographs or no pictures of it apart from in the distance. A very magnificent place. But we're not here really to talk about individual houses. I want to talk a little bit more about John Eady Manning, who started to develop Dawlish in the early 1800s after he had bought the manor of Dawlish. Now, it set him back a lot of money, and straightening the brook, and then building the manor house in about 1808 to 1810, and in 1810 also was when there was a terrific storm in Dawlish, and that washed away all the improvements he had made to the lawn and to the brook, straightening the brook, you remember. That was all washed away, along with several cattle, bridges and cottages as well. I don't think anybody actually lost their life, but it set him back by £11,000, which, having already spent out for doing all the work there, this was on top. And £11,000 then is about £1 million now. And sadly, that actually then led to his bankruptcy at that time. And he left Dawlish. He actually went to Europe for a time, came back again, and then actually emigrated to Australia and became quite a big name in Australia. Now, whilst we're standing on Lea Mount, he bought this. I don't know whether it was for his leisure and pleasure, or whether he might have had the idea that perhaps he would build himself another house up here. He never did, but the view up the coast is actually quite something stunning. Whilst we're talking about the view up the coast as well, just mention very quickly, way back in time, the original settlers here who settled by the parish church at St Gregory's, that this would have been a great lookout point for them when they were scanning up and down the coast to see whether there were any pirates, barbarians or Vikings who were sailing up and down and perhaps coming to sack whatever was here. But they never did sack Dawlish. They sacked Teignmouth. They made an attack on Exeter because they were based at Exmouth in the distance. They didn't take Exeter, and eventually they did disappear. So we didn't get attacked by the Vikings, but if you read one of my books, they did stop here one time and were massacred by the locals. But that's all made up, but it's a good little story. Anyway, coming back up to date, up to the 1800s again. In 1810 I mentioned previously that the stagecoach started. Now, the Dawlish, or London to Dawlish stagecoach journey would take you 5 to 6 days. This was in 1810. The roads were very poor, they were potholed, they were gravel rather than tarmac, and there were highwaymen as well. So there'd be various stops on the way, coaching inns and so forth. And so therefore the Georgians who came didn't just come down for a few days on the coast, they came down for a season with servants and their families. So in 1810, that was when the stagecoach started. In the 1820s, in about 1823, a company was set up called the Turnpike Trust, and this was set up to improve the roads throughout the area, but it really made a difference to the accessibility of Dawlish and Teignmouth, because it cut the journey time of the stagecoach journey from London down to Dawlish from 6 days down to about 4 days. That still sounds a long time, and it was a long time. And of course, the stagecoach could only take 10,000 people, so people did arrive in dribs and drabs. There were 5 or 6 stagecoaches a day from Exeter, so people did arrive, perhaps 50 at a time, 50 a day at a time. But the big change that came to Dawlish was about 20 years later, when Isambard Kingdom Brunel set his sights on Dawlish as his means of taking the train from Exeter to Plymouth. And he was responsible for so much building in the country, bridges, tunnels, and all sorts. But mainly he's remembered for the railway which runs from London Paddington down to Plymouth and then into Cornwall down to Penzance. So by the mid-1830s he had more or less finished the line from London to Bristol, then set his sights on Bristol to Exeter, and this was finished by the late 1830s, and he then set his eyes on Exeter down to Plymouth and beyond. And in 1841 he was ready to, he got his plans ready, he was ready to start acquiring land and put all the pieces into place so he could start the building. But he had a lot of opposition, not only from people in Dawlish, particularly those that lived along Marine Parade, and more pertinently the fishermen who were used to hauling their boats up onto the beach and having easy access to and from the town onto the beach, but also local landowners. In particular, you think of the Earl of Devon, Lord Courtenay, who did not want these new iron horses running along the estuary in front of his beloved castle, and he put up a lot of opposition. Admiral Pellew, who lived in Bitton House in Teignmouth, he put up a lot of that opposition because the trains were going to be running at the bottom of his garden. But eventually he got permission from the landowners. He actually had to buy some of the houses along Marine Parade because the people would not be pacified, so he bought the houses and compensated them, paid them off, and he was ready to start work by 1843. And by 1846 the line was open, and that was Bank Holiday Monday in May 1846. There was great fanfares. He got everybody on his side at that time. The Earl of Devon even turned out at Starcross to watch the train go through, and in Dawlish there was great partying and a great reception for him. And by Christmas of 1846 he had actually got to Teignmouth as well. And when you think of what he had to do, there was the embankment over Cockwood Marsh, there was the seawall along the seafront at Dawlish, there was an embankment in front of the castle so that the sea, or the estuary, which was much wider at that time, the water even came up to the banks of or to the castle wall. He had to tame the estuary. Perhaps the greatest task for Brunel line was the going through Langstone Cliff, because we can see Langstone Cliff in the end, and that was a promontory, so it was attached to the mainland. Now he's had to blast his way actually through the cliff face to make the gap in the middle. Originally he wanted to take it out round Langstone Cliff, but the water was too deep and the storms were too great. He also wanted to take the railway around the cliffs in Dawlish, and beyond and towards Teignmouth as well. As it turned out, he built 5 tunnels between Dawlish and Teignmouth, and imagine the work that had to be done through sandstone. Okay, it's a relatively soft stone, but he didn't have much in the way of mechanical means. It was all labour, and he did have dynamite, but he had to be careful with that so he didn't blow up the cliffs. But 2,000 men, navvies, a lot from Ireland, but from all over, came and lived in the area for the 3 years that the work was going on. Now, to my mind, 3 years to build from Exeter through to Teignmouth is pretty good going when you think what Network Rail are taking to redo the seawall in Dawlish. Now, the opening of the railway line had an immediate effect on Dawlish. Remember, the population of Dawlish at this time was about 4,000, something like that, a little bit more perhaps. So about a quarter of the size of it is now. So everybody would have known everybody else. But the immediate effect of the railway line was that whereas the time taken to get from London down to Dawlish had been first 6 days and then coming down to about 4 days, was now down to about 4 or 5 hours. So that was had a huge impact. Suddenly people were able to travel more easily, and remember the train, which was the atmospheric railway to start with, could take hundreds of people rather than 10 or a dozen as it would have been on the stagecoach. So suddenly people were going to be arriving in great numbers rather than penny numbers. And where were they going to stay? Well, there was an explosion of hotel building at that time. So all round where the railway station is now and was back then, hotels started to spring up from about 1850. So we had the Grand Hotel, we had the Royal Hotel, we had the York Hotel, the Richmond. A few years later there was the Blenheim, there was the Commercial Hotel, even at one stage there was a Temperance Hotel, but that didn't last long in Dawlish for some reason. Temperance, there's no alcohol to be had. And also just around about there were other little hotels that sprung up as well, which had been built as private houses, a bit like the Charlton House, which was built as a house and became a little hotel. Other bigger buildings that had been private houses in the good old days when people really wanted big houses, they started to become hotels and bed and breakfasts as well. And there was springing up lodging rooms as well. Not everybody wanted to stay in a hotel, but they wanted either a house to stay in or lodging rooms to stay in. And coming up Westcliff, there were big houses there which were divided into lodging rooms and apartments. So all these people started to arrive in Dawlish. What facilities did they have? Well, there were already public reading rooms, there was already public baths, and there was the lawn as well, which had started turning into quite nice pleasure gardens. But people came to Dawlish really for relaxation. Invalids, as I've said before, were encouraged to come and take the sea air. Well, it was still invalids, as it were, but it was also those who just wanted to promenade along the sea wall, sit on the beach, or take the sea air. And it wasn't just the holiday makers or the wealthy Georgians who benefited from this. The local population benefited as well from the new employment opportunities. You needed more blacksmiths because people were coming in private coaches. You needed builders, you needed carpenters, you needed plasterers, you needed roofers, you needed all sorts of domestic staff as well, servants and those to look after the wealthy who were coming. There was new shops that sprang up as well, everything from haberdashery to milliners to sedan chair makers, even, you name it. Dawlish had something to cater for all these people who were coming. Initial benefits to the local population and to the visitors as well, ease of access, but there were many other things which followed on in the years that were to come in the second half of the 19th century. Things like building, things like churches, things like shops, things like the agricultural revolution leading into the industrial revolution. So we'll cover that next time, and thank you very much for listening today. I hope you've enjoyed it.